In the world of Westeros, a chilling tale of fire and blood captivated millions. House of the Dragon brought us the brutal saga of the Targaryen civil war, the Dance of the Dragons, a conflict of incest, betrayal, and catastrophic destruction that tore a dynasty apart and plunged a realm into chaos. We watched as family turned against family, dragons burned cities, and the very fabric of society unraveled. But what if I told you that this epic fantasy, for all its dragons and magic, is deeply rooted in real historical horrors? That the psychological dread of the Dance of the Dragons echoes through the brutal chronicles of our own past? This Anatomy of Dread documentary will conduct a deep psychological autopsy on the real historical conflicts, the genuine royal betrayals, and the horrifying medieval mindsets that inspired George R.R. Martin's vision of Westeros. We will dissect the true games of thrones that played out in our world, exposing a human capacity for cruelty and political machination that is every bit as dark, and perhaps even more chilling, than the dragons of fiction. Forget the fantasy. It is time to meet the true monsters of history. It is time to confront the real dread that birthed the Dance of the Dragons. To understand the Dance of the Dragons, we must first understand its primary historical inspiration, the Wars of the Roses. This brutal, dynastic civil war tore England apart for over 30 years in the 15th century, and its echoes are palpable throughout George R.R. Martin's Westeros. From a psychological perspective, the Wars of the Roses was the ultimate Game of Thrones long before the term existed. It was a conflict born from a crisis of succession, a weak king, and two powerful noble houses, the House of Lancaster, represented by a red rose, and the House of York, a white rose, with competing claims to the English throne. Sound familiar? The dread of this era was pervasive. Imagine living in a world where your loyalty to a king could mean your family's ruin if the opposing faction seized power. The lines of allegiance shifted constantly. Brothers fought brothers, fathers fought sons, and noble families were decimated overnight. The concept of an honorable death on the battlefield was often a lie. Captured nobles were frequently executed, their lands seized, and their families left destitute. This was not a war of ideologies. It was a war of personal power, vengeance, and ambition. Precisely the raw human desires that fuel the Dance of the Dragons. Just as Rhaenyra and Alicent's children face an uncertain future, so too did the children of York and Lancaster. Royal heirs were not safe. They were pawns, often imprisoned, murdered, or disappeared to eliminate rival claims. The infamous princes in the Tower, two young royal boys who vanished, likely murdered, to secure Richard III's throne, is a chilling historical parallel to many of Westeros' dark fates. The violence was visceral and deeply personal. Medieval battles were not distant affairs. They were chaotic, bloody melees with swords, axes, and longbows. Casualties were high, and the aftermath was often marked by brutal reprisals. This was a world without mercy, where a change of crown could mean a purge of all who served the losing side. George R.R. Martin studied this period extensively, drawing direct inspiration for his warring houses, the fickle loyalties, the brutal family betrayals, and the ever-present threat of violence lurking beneath the veneer of courtly life. The psychological horror of the Dance of the Dragons, the paranoia, the ambition, the constant threat of a brutal end, is a direct mirror of the very real dread that consumed England during the devastating Wars of the Roses. The Dance of the Dragons in House of the Dragon hinges entirely on the brutal question of royal succession. Who will sit on the Iron Throne after King Viserys? This drama of shifting loyalties, disputed claims, and familial betrayal is not mere fantasy. It is a direct reflection of the savage reality of medieval European monarchies. From a psychological perspective, medieval royal succession was an anatomy of dread for everyone involved. For the monarch, it was the constant fear of being overthrown or assassinated. For the heirs, it was a ruthless competition where only one could survive, and the stakes were literally life and death. For the noble families, choosing the wrong side could mean utter destruction. Consider the historical examples that paralleled the Targaryens' struggle. The Empress Matilda and King Stephen the Anarchy, England, 12th century. King Henry I named his daughter Matilda as his heir, making his nobles swear an oath to her. But upon his death, many reneged on their oath, favoring his nephew Stephen, leading to a brutal 19-year civil war known as the Anarchy. This mirrors Princess Rhaenyra's claim being challenged by Aegon II despite her father's wishes. The psychological impact of such a protracted, bloody conflict on a kingdom was devastating. The Byzantine Empire, This empire was a hotbed of succession crises, where blinding, castration, and assassination were common tools to remove rivals. Sibling rivalry was often settled with extreme prejudice. This level of courtly brutality makes the Targaryens' familial infighting seem almost tame by comparison. The constant paranoia, the inability to trust even your closest relatives, was a daily reality for anyone near power. The dread for medieval monarchs and their families was very real. There was no graceful retirement. Losing a claim to the throne often meant a swift execution, imprisonment, or exile, not just for the claimant, but for their entire bloodline. Children were vulnerable pawns, often married off to secure alliances, or murdered to eliminate a threat. The idea of a safe succession was almost alien. This environment fostered extreme paranoia and a deeply cynical view of human nature. Loyalty was a fleeting commodity, bought with land, titles, or threats. Promises were easily broken. The psychological pressure to maintain a grip on power, or to seize it, was overwhelming, often driving individuals to commit acts of extreme cruelty that make the fictional betrayals of Westeros seem remarkably familiar. The Dance of the Dragons captures this brutal historical reality perfectly. It's a testament to the fact that, when absolute power is at stake, the veneer of family loyalty and moral principles often crumbles, revealing the darkest aspects of human ambition. The true dragons of history were not mythical beasts, but the men and women consumed by the insatiable hunger for the crown, leaving a trail of blood and betrayal in their wake. In Westeros, the Targaryen dynasty is infamous for its practice of royal incest, marrying brother to sister to keep the bloodline pure and avoid outside challenges to their unique dragon-riding heritage. This shocking aspect of House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones is perhaps the most obvious marker of their distinct identity. But even this dark fantasy element has chilling historical echoes, though less common and more taboo in medieval Europe. From a psychological perspective, medieval royal marriages were rarely about love. They were the ultimate political chess moves. Princes and princesses were pawns, their marriages meticulously negotiated to forge alliances, consolidate power, or bring new lands under control. The dread for royal children was that their entire life, their body, and their future were not their own. They were tools of the state. While sibling marriage was largely forbidden by the Christian Church in medieval Europe, unlike the Targaryens, strategic and often highly controversial marriages between close relatives were common, especially between cousins. These unions, though not incestuous by Targaryen standards, were still driven by the relentless pursuit of power and property within a closed aristocratic circle. The aim was always to keep wealth and influence concentrated, echoing the Targaryen desire to keep the bloodline pure for different, yet equally self-serving reasons. But beyond marriage, the medieval court was a viper's nest of intrigue where the stakes were death. Just as characters in Westeros often meet their end through a poisoned goblet or a sudden illness, so too did many historical figures. Consider the Borgias' Renaissance Italy. This infamous family, while later than the true medieval period, exemplifies the ruthless use of poison to eliminate rivals, consolidate power, and erase threats to succession. Their reputation for political murder, often via undetectable poisons, created an atmosphere of profound paranoia in European courts. Every meal, every drink, could be a potential death sentence. England's King John and Arthur of Brittany, early 13th century, King John, a real-life inspiration for many Game of Thrones villains, likely ordered the murder of his own nephew Arthur, a rival claimant to the throne. The method was never confirmed, but the disappearance of inconvenient heirs was a common, terrifying feature of royal politics. The psychological impact of living in such a court was one of constant, pervasive dread. Who could you trust? Every smile could hide a dagger. Every offer of wine could hide a poison. The beautiful dresses and grand banquets often masked a brutal reality where human life was cheap, and loyalty was a temporary commodity. The Dance of the Dragons vividly portrays this suffocating atmosphere, where familial bonds are shredded by ambition, and the very concept of safety within the family is an illusion. The medieval world, in its brutal pursuit of power, knew all too well the chilling effectiveness of using marriage, and the ultimate silence of poison, as tools to secure a throne. In House of the Dragon, the Dance of the Dragons sees cities like Harrenhal and King's Landing suffer immense destruction, with dragons raining fire upon populations. While dragons are fantasy, the psychological dread of civilian suffering during medieval warfare was a brutal, horrifying reality, often far worse than the dramatized versions. From a psychological perspective, medieval warfare was not just about clashes of armies. It was often a deliberate strategy of total war against the population to break the will of the enemy. The aim was to destroy resources, spread terror, and make loyalty to the opposing side utterly untenable. Consider the reality, the sacking of cities. When a city was besieged and eventually fell, the outcome for its inhabitants was almost universally catastrophic. Soldiers, starved and desperate, would often be given free rein to plunder, rape, and murder. There was no civilian protection as we understand it. Men were killed, women often brutalized, and children left to starve or enslaved. The psychological trauma of such events, endured by entire populations, was immense. Scorched earth tactics. Armies would deliberately burn crops, destroy villages, and slaughter livestock to deny resources to their enemies and to spread terror among the populace. This wasn't just a military tactic, it was an act of psychological warfare designed to instill widespread dread and force submission. The suffering of the common people was immense and rarely recorded by history's victors. Famine and disease. Wars disrupted agriculture and trade routes, leading to widespread famine. Concentrated populations during sieges, coupled with poor sanitation, led to rampant disease, which often killed more people than actual combat. The dread of starvation and plague was a constant companion for medieval peasants, amplified by conflict. The terrifying power of dragons in House of the Dragon serves as a powerful metaphor for the most destructive forces of medieval warfare. While no actual dragons burned cities, the indiscriminate destruction by fire was a very real tool of medieval warfare, whether from trebuchets launching incendiaries or simply soldiers putting torches to homes. The screams of the dying, the smell of smoke, the loss of everything. These were not fictional elements, but the horrifying daily reality for countless historical civilians. The Dance of the Dragons perfectly captures this grim historical truth, that civil wars, fueled by the ambitions of the powerful, inevitably wreak untold destruction upon the innocent. The dread that grips the common people of Westeros as dragons fight overhead is a visceral echo of the very real, terrifying fear that consumed the medieval populace caught in the crossfire of warring lords and kings. It is a reminder that the human cost of power struggles is always paid, not by the mighty, but by the anonymous masses. And so, the true brutal history behind House of the Dragon's Dance of the Dragons is revealed. George R.R. Martin's world, for all its dragons, prophecies, and magic, is deeply rooted in the very real, very human capacity for cruelty, ambition, and betrayal that defined medieval history. The Wars of the Roses, the brutal politics of succession, the use of poison, and the horrific cost of war on civilians, these are not fantasy elements, but mirrors of our own dark past. So, why are we so drawn to these stories? Why does the dread of Westeros, or the real medieval world, captivate us so profoundly? From a psychological perspective, it speaks to a fundamental human fascination with power, violence, and the darker side of human nature. These stories allow us to explore the extremes of ambition and brutality from a safe distance. We can witness the collapse of dynasties, the betrayal of families, and the horrors of war, without personally enduring the real dread. The anatomy of dread compels us to understand not just what happened, but why it happened, and what it reveals about us. The fictional Targaryens, for all their dragons, are ultimately driven by the same very human desires and fears that drove historical kings and queens. The desire for ultimate power, the fear of losing it, and the willingness to sacrifice everything, even family, to achieve it. The genius of House of the Dragon and Game of Thrones is in their ability to strip away the romanticized notions of medieval chivalry and expose the raw, visceral reality of power. They show us a world where justice is often arbitrary, good deeds go unrewarded, and evil frequently triumphs. This mirrors the brutal unpredictability of actual history far more accurately than many other fantasy stories. The enduring dread of these tales lies in their timeless relevance. While our world no longer has dragons or medieval kings in the same way, the psychological forces that drove the Dance of the Dragons, greed, paranoia, tribalism, and the desperate struggle for control, are still very much alive. These stories act as a chilling historical and fictional warning, reminding us of what happens when these primal forces are unleashed without restraint. And this is the final, chilling lesson from our investigation. The real history behind House of the Dragon reminds us that the greatest monsters are often not mythical beasts, but the men and women who wield power. And the anatomy of dread reveals that sometimes, the most captivating stories are the ones that dare to show us the darkest reflections of ourselves. And so, the final investigation is now passed to you. After dissecting the fantasy and the historical reality, what do you believe is the most enduring psychological truth that House of the Dragon reveals about human nature and power? Leave your analysis in the comments below. Let's continue the discussion about the dark inspirations behind Westeros and the chilling lessons they offer us today.